Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to my series of discussions on Giorgio Agamben's book, Homo Sacer. I think the correct pronunciation of Homo Sacer is actually Homo Sacer, but I find that harder to say, so I'm going to stick with the pronunciation as Homo Sacer, which I've heard other people say. It just rolls easier off the tongue for me, so I'm going to stick with that pronunciation, whether it's correct or not. Um, And this is a book that came out in 1995 and has since become one of the great political classics of the postmodern epoch, the epoch of contemporary theory. Now note that when we're talking about contemporary theory that comes out of Italy, it's almost all concerned with political theory, whether we think of Agamben or Gianni Vattimo or Antonio Negri or Bifo, whoever it is that we have in mind that's coming out of Italy in the postmodern epoch is almost invariably concerned with politics, with political theory. Why that should be the case, I'm not entirely certain, but I do think that it's interesting that if we compare, let's say, Agamben and his obsession with political ideas with somebody like Cornelius Castoriadis, who was a Greek, who was displaced to France, but was nevertheless, as his name indicates, Greek. The concerns between the two of them, Castoriadis was concerned with metaphysics and with cultural theory, more so than with political theory, and Agamben more with political thought than cultural thought. It's a little bit like a replay of the distinction between the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks were more metaphysically inclined and concerned. The Romans were, of course, famous for their political ideas and political history and theory. So it is interesting the way that thinkers very often have the ghosts behind them of their own traditions. The traditions that they come out of invisibly shape their thinking. If we think of German contemporary theory, whether we think of Sloterdijk or Jürgen Habermas, let's say, or Niklas Luhmann, it's generally a kind of German equivalent of media studies that we're talking about as postmodern theory. And in between Germany and Italy, we have, of course, France. French theory is theory par excellence, theory with a capital T. Which is abstractly inclined, theoretically inclined, and inclined to the construction of metaphysical thought systems or deconstruction of them. But in either case, whether you're deconstructing with Derrida a metaphysical system or constructing with Badiou a new one, the concerns are still both equally metaphysical. So that's what I want to say just at the start here. And what I want to do then is to look at Agamben's book, Homo Sacer, which is subtitled Sovereign Power and Bare Life. And in today's lecture, I just want to discuss the introduction. Now, if we turn to the introduction, and I'm using this classic edition here, and if we turn to the introduction, Agamben begins by making a linguistic distinction. And notice that Agamben's background is in the philosophy of language. So he's concerned with linguistics, and he begins by making a linguistic point where he says that the Greeks had two different words for life, zoe and bios. So he starts off by making this famous distinction. Notice that this distinction, zoe and bios, comes from the Greek language, mainly from Aristotle, whereas Homo Sacer is a Latin term. It comes out of Roman, it's an obscure figure, as we'll get to, of archaic Roman thought. So watch what he's doing with these distinctions. Now, the distinction between zoe and bios is absolutely fundamental to get. It's one of the most important points of the whole book, since Agamben will argue that essentially what is happening is that, in one respect, I think the book is a sort of response to Alain Badiou's book Ethics, which had come out 2 years before it in 1993, in which Badiou attacked the sort of global international world order backed by the UN and the IMF and the World Bank and all of that and its various humanitarian interventions as essentially hypocritical. Badiou had said in that book Ethics that the global world order, which is mostly just a cover for American unilateral acts around the world, and these acts are always touted as humanitarian interventions into atrocities, it's hypocritical on the one hand because the American order says we'll respect your differences so long as you're like us. The more like us you are, if you have democracy and free trade agreements and you've got loans from the World Bank and you're not practicing barbaric things like clitoridectomies and putting veils over your women's faces, then we'll talk about respecting your differences. So there's a basic hypocrisy there, as well as, and this is what I think Agamben is responding to, the idea that these sort of heroic interventions tend to reduce these third world countries, which tend to be, though not always, the places where these humanitarian atrocities take place, to the status of victims, and tends to dehumanize them and reduce them to a kind of animalistic status where they can't help themselves and they require the superhero landing in his Black Hawk helicopter to help them from predation by one or another totalitarian regime or dictator or group. ISIS is the most recent manifestation of this, to save them. And so there's a reduction in ontological status of the people that the Americans, or let's call it the UN if we want to, intervene and help to save. There's an ontological reduction to the status of victims and a kind of animalization or bestialization of them in that process. And I think that's what Agamben is responding to here. That animalization process that Badiou speaks of in ethics becomes here the discussion of Zoe. When you think of Zoe, you should immediately think zoological, because that's what it means. The Greek word for life in general is Zoe, which means essentially zoological, animal life. Whereas bios is the word for the human life in the polis, politically represented. Now, women, children, and old men are in the mode of Zoe because they don't have representation in the polisphere, in the political realm. So they, and the domestic sphere is the realm of Zoe as well, in addition to the world of barnyard animals and domestic animals and sheep and goats and so forth. All that is Zoe, bare naked life, as Agamben translates it in this text. But in the political sphere we have the bios, which means that the bios politikos, the properly human mode of existence that differentiates and extracts the human from out of the animalistic background and dignifies him by conferring upon him language. Now, Agamben makes this distinction between voice and language. Animals have voices that can register pleasure and pain, but they don't have language. Only the human being has language. And the language is what, as Aristotle says, enables the individual to define what is just and unjust within the political sphere, the bios politikos, which is not the same thing as Foucault's biopolitical, as we'll get to in a moment. That's a very different idea. But now what Agamben is going to track is the eruption and intervention of the zoological into the bios politikos, the properly human political order. The two are becoming intermixed and indiscernible in today's modernity, in which Agamben essentially is going to accuse and say that, I mean, Badiou essentially in ethics, in his book Ethics, criticizes the democratic nation state as presenting itself to the victimized third world populations that it's forever helping as essentially democratic. But Agamben's going to go a step further and say, guess what? These apparent democracies are actually not democracies. They are totalitarian states in the guise of democracies. And we can figure this out by looking at the eruption of the biological, the zoological, into their politics, where you are treated as an individual, not as a subject of power, which is proper to a democracy in essence, as a proper democracy, whereas in a totalitarian state, you are the object of power. But more and more with the biopolitical, you are treated as an object, like an animal, basically. And so that's basically what's happening in democratic nation states. You have rights only insofar as you are allowed to have them, but they can be withdrawn from you at a moment's notice. And so it isn't really a democracy. It is totalitarianism in disguise. Those rights that you have can be withdrawn from you at a moment's notice, and you can be carted off to Guantanamo Bay, where you are in the state of Zoe, bare naked life, and anything can be done to you. You can be tortured or killed with impunity, without trial. All of those things can happen and take place. And so Agamben's going to accuse in this book these democratic modern states as themselves actually not democratic anymore at all. In essence, their substance has undergone a transubstantiation process. Notice this in the Catholic rite of the transubstantiation process, you get the blood and the wine. When the priest utters the logos that comes down and transforms them visibly, they look the same, bread and wine. But now after he's pronounced the magic of the rite, ontologically, they've been transubstantiated and their substance is no longer the same. They are the body and blood now of Christ. although they look the same. In a similar way, I think Agamben is saying that the democratic nation state is like that. It looks like a democracy that's still there, but its ontological status has changed. It has undergone a transubstantiation process whereby internally, essentially, it's a totalitarian state that grants you rights only insofar as it sees fit to do so, and can suspend those rights at a moment's notice, whenever it wants to. So we're really no longer living in democratic states as far as Agamben is concerned. And I think this is a really excoriating analysis of the state of the modern nation state. So he begins with this distinction between Zoe and bios. Zoe is the zoological. Bios is like the biographical, or the realm of, not the biological. It's more related to the biographical, the realm of inscriptions, where you are inscribed into the juridical, political machinery of the state through representation. Your name is there. You're inscribed into the machine. You have political rights. You have representation. All of that is part of the process of bios, of being inscribed into the political order, into the machinery of the state that began with the Greeks. And it's a process of excluding Zoe, but Zoe in a certain way is also included precisely by means of its exclusion. By excluding it, you're also taking recognition of it, so you're also including it through the very process of excluding it. So it's an exclusive inclusion, this idea of excluding Zoe. And he's going to say, as the text develops, as he moves through the introduction here, that he's going to uncover this obscure figure of Roman legal thought, Homo Sacer. The Homo Sacer is the man who can be killed with impunity, but he's sacred. And so therein lies the paradox. The Homo Sacer is the individual who is sacred, but the sacred for Agamben is that which has been removed from the social order, that which is outside the state, that which is in a different sphere. So in that sense, Homo Sacer has been removed from the bios order, from the political sphere, and reduced to the status of Zoe, bare naked life. Like an animal, he can be killed with impunity. Although Homo Sacer is not just the same thing as Zoe. Zoe is bare naked life, but Homo Sacer is the man from whom bios has been withdrawn, and he's been reduced to the status of Zoe. So it's a devolutionary idea, whereas the individual in the state is Zoe, the animal who has been ennobled and uplifted into bios, who has been elevated. So there's an evolutionary aspect to inscription within the bios order, the bios politikos order, the order of democracy, but let's say proper, the political order proper, the polis proper. But Homo Sacer is the one that can be killed with impunity. Anyone can kill him with impunity, which means not only can they not be tried in a court of law, they are also not stained with taboo or sacrilege. If you kill somebody who's sacred, you would normally think, if they're sacred and you kill them, you've offended the gods in some way. But the Homo Sacer is one who is sacred and yet can be killed by anyone. And so that'll be a sort of undecidable term, a paradox that Agamben will eventually work his way toward to resolve that paradox, and we'll see what that means, what the status of the one who can be killed with impunity and yet at the same time is sacred, what that means. But he's basically going to say that Homo Sacer is the individual in the concentration camp, but the concentration camp is no longer, as he says, the state of exception, it's the rule. We're living in a sort of gigantic concentration camp and we don't even know it, since any one of us can have our rights revoked at any time and then can be killed with impunity. We just don't realize it, but it can happen, especially after 9/11. This book, interestingly, was written before 9/11 and became even more prescient and topical after 9/11 took place. So there's very interesting stuff going on here with Agamben. This is one of the great political treatises, one of the great works of political philosophy of the latter half of the 20th century. And so as we get more into it, what we'll see is he'll begin with a discussion of Carl Schmitt's political theology, where Schmitt elucidates the idea of the state of exception in the first section, and then the first section will end with a discussion of Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, which I want to get to. And then the second section will move into the concept of Homo Sacer proper, where he'll resolve the antinomian undecidability about Homo Sacer, not by saying that he's not an undecidable. Homo Sacer is, in essence, undecidable. That'll be part of the whole point of what he's making. So we'll leave it there for the introduction, just as the sort of initial warm-up, the initial approach to Agamben's masterpiece here.